What used to be the most populated country in the world has now reported that its population is actually shrinking. China is seeing the lowest number of births since the year 1950. So how is this going to impact the global economy? We're going to bring this up with our experts who are joining us on this edition of India Tonight. But first, a report where I break down the basic facts of China and its population. Now, it may not be long that you will call China the world's most populated country. Today, China has reported that its population has shrunk for the first time since the year 1961. And experts suggest that the era of negative population growth has actually begun in the communist country. What does this mean for China? More importantly, what does it mean for the global economy? And that's exactly what we're looking to explain today. Let's get to the numbers first. Now, China's government says 9.56 million people were born in 2022. In that same period, 10.41 million people died. It brought down the country's total population down by 850,000 people. Experts suggest that a declining population could spell a demographic crisis for China and a much wider economic issue for the globalized economy. But let's look at how this could really impact China. What does it really mean for China? An aging population means more people will depend on the government spending than the number of taxpayers. When the number of taxpayers goes down, the government will likely struggle to spend money on taking care of its elderly population. And assuming that China does care for its elderly, it could see its national debt rise. But bad news for China means bad news for the world as well. China is currently the factory for the world due to its cheap labor. But with an aging population beyond the age of retirement, China may struggle to keep growing at the rate that it has been growing in the recent past. If this eventually hurts China's manufacturing industry, it could raise prices of goods in the globalized world. And the countries that would suffer the most are those in Europe and, of course, USA. But that's where India stands to benefit. India's working class population is expected to surpass China's in less than 5 years, making it a prime destination that could act as an alternative to China. India also has a lower cost of labor than China, which makes it the most appealing destination for setting up factories. This could bring in more investments into India. A large working population and a relatively lower elderly population also means that India will benefit from its demographic dividend. India can collect more taxes from its working population and spend relatively less on social welfare programs for the elderly. China's one-child policy is widely believed to be the reason for its population decline. While the government has reversed its policy over the years, experts do not see China's population growing anytime soon. But then again, China could argue that the next decades of human civilization is going to depend more heavily on automation, more heavily on artificial intelligence, and this would reduce the dependence on humans. Let's just put this in context. Whatever we are hearing and understanding as far as the shrinking of Chinese population is concerned, what are the repercussions for the Chinese economy and for the world at large? Jose Torres is joining us. He's a senior economist at Interactive Brokers. Jose, always a pleasure connecting with you. Do tell us, how much of a demographic crisis do you see in the Chinese shrinking population? Do you see the fall in its working population deeply impact its growth, because there's a sense that tax revenues would fall and the government debt would rise because of higher healthcare costs? Do you see this too?
Good evening, Vikram. Thanks for having me. I do see a demographic struggle in China. They really managed COVID in a non-ideal way. And then on top of that, the birth rate is really low. When folks feel that economic prospects aren't that great, they don't reproduce. So China is suffering demographically because their death rate is higher and their birth rate is lower. And it doesn't bode well for their manufacturing sector at a time when the world is looking to rely less on China and more on India, like you said earlier. India has the strength, they have the people, they have the innovation, and they have the education. So unfortunately for China, they're in a bad spot right now economically. Also, they've also depended a lot on debt and the real estate sector over the last decade or two to fuel a lot of that economic growth that they've been seeing. Well, real estate has been a significant problem globally and specifically in China in 2022, and it's not looking to get better. So if real estate remains a headwind and if manufacturing continues to weaken, I don't see China doing that well in the next decade.
So, Jose, this is rather interesting what you pointed out, that the population might be declining because the Chinese growth story, there are speed breakers to it right now. So one problem feeds off the other, wouldn't you say?
Yes, I would say that. And the draconian measures of zero COVID make the people upset. The people, we saw the people protesting. That's something that we're not used to seeing in communist China. The people are upset, and when they're upset, they don't want to reproduce as much. So maybe they have one child or two children instead of two or three. And incrementally, that does affect the bottom line pretty materially when a large segment of the population doesn't see positive economic prospects in the future and is not happy with the government. Again, I think that China's problems internally as well as globally, where the Western nations don't trust them as much since COVID, opens the door for India to become a big leader in global trade, because India has more of a Western democracy kind of culture that can work a lot better with the EU and with the USA.
When you say that, Jose, and I was going to come to that, but there are growth concerns all over the world at this point in time. So is aging population a problem for the world that they have to find answers to, not just China?
It's a problem, but then on the other side, there's also some offsetting factors with the environment as well. So I think it's too early to say that we're in a global demographic crisis. Population growth is slowing, but it's still growing globally. Some nations have problems with population, but particularly in Asia, like China, Japan, South Korea, etc. But I think it's too early on the global stage to say that we're in a demographic crisis. I do think it is specific to some nations.
How will China's declining population affect its status as, we call it the factory to the world? Some argue that technology and artificial intelligence is what's going to push that agenda for China and elsewhere in the world. So we may not need to rely so much on humans and humans in China. What's your take on that?
Well, my take is that if technology is going to become less labor intensive, meaning that we need less workers, then the world is going to rely on China less anyway, because they'd rather have the robots and all the sophisticated technology at home rather than in China. Why would the USA have artificial intelligence and sophisticated technology in China when they don't need them, right? They need the Chinese because of the low cost of labor, like what you were saying earlier. The technology makes the world less labor intensive, and that moves stuff into the USA. At the same time, Vikram, AI and the sophisticated technology and the automation hasn't worked as fast as we thought. It is very expensive to install and maintain all those systems, which again opens the door for India for a lot of those businesses and manufacturing companies that maybe are lower margin, that can't afford all those sophisticated technologies. They can rely on India to provide that low cost of labor and boost profits and economic growth higher.
In the meantime, do you see reduced output from China spurring inflation in the West, where China exports in a big way, especially Europe and US? Do you see that happening?
I do think that inflation is going to be structurally higher for some time. It's going to be tough, for example, in the USA to maintain that 2% target. But I think that we can learn to live in a 3 or 3.5% inflationary era. And a lot remains to be seen as far as how India can fill in that void that China is leaving incrementally, and how all the pieces of the puzzles come together. That's a lot of uncertainty, but I am forecasting a mild recession in 2023 globally. I think the question is, how do we come back from that economic contraction, and how, again, the pieces to the puzzle combine, and how we look in the next year or two.
One clear advantage that India, of course, speaks about and many acknowledge is the demographic dividend that India has, which is seen in its much younger workforce. Besides that, what are the real advantages that you see that India has that could help it take away the kind of business that China has attracted for such a long time?
Well, I think internally the people are in a better position with their own government than in China. Second, I think that India is also has better relations globally than China. China does not really have great relations globally at the moment, whereas India has good relations with the West. And like you said earlier, that labor force is crucial, right, for these labor-intensive manufacturing companies that need that low cost of labor to fuel profits and to move goods all around the world. And I think that those are the advantages that India has. And I'll add one more thing, Vikram, more reliability, right? These factories require billions and billions of dollars, right? And when companies make these investments, at this point, Vikram, what I'm seeing is that they'd rather take a hit to margins and make a little less money as long as it's more reliable over the next 5 or 10 years. You know, we can't go back. A lot of these companies don't want to deal with China turning the button on and off. Oh, you can do business today, tomorrow you can't. You know, in India, I don't think that's going to, the companies feel a lot better about doing business there. They don't think that the government is going to be as draconian to foreign companies operating there.
All good to hear. Thank you very much, Jose, for putting perspective into this big story about the shrinking population in China. We'll see exactly how this becomes advantage India. And the hope is certainly for all the people in India watching this that actually does happen. We'll keep watching the situation. But thanks very much for joining us, Jose. Always a pleasure.
My pleasure, Vikram.
Now let's take a look.